precarity that I haven't experienced have long known that they can't rely on the norms of the system to protect them. But for me, that was kind of the first time I had to truly confront the dramatic failures of the guardrails of democratic institutions. Suddenly, my role as a participant in democracy felt different, simultaneously more important and more precarious than I had realized. Obviously, I wasn't the only one experiencing upheaval in those days. In my first classes after the election, the students were very emotional. Some of them were excited about the outcome. Some of them were upset. I had taken anonymous polls the class before, and so I knew I had about 50% who had voted for Trump and 50% who had voted for Clinton. But they were all sort of in emotional turmoil over how disrupted many of their relationships had been in the wake of that election. They had been called out on social media by friends who voted differently or had fractures in their families. And so we retooled the syllabus and spent that first class period after the election talking about that experience. And at the end of the last class of the day, a student said, I wish I could have conversations like this outside of my philosophy classes. I wish I could take a whole class that would teach me skills to have these kinds of hard conversations. So we spent the rest of that class period talking about what that would look like. And it planted a seed that within the next year grew into the course that I now teach almost every semester, called Dialogue and Civil Discourse, that brings students together from across the political spectrum to talk about these controversial issues and to build skills and virtues for having these conversations. It's been taught now for 5 years, and it's been a really transformative experience for me, and I hope it's been beneficial for students. We've now also expanded it to a broader set of programs called the Dialogue Project. So there was a little bookmark that students helped design in there. So now the Dialogue Project includes a component for the first year class, a kind of enriched set of content that the whole first year class gets, and then more sections of the course, as well as hopefully a summer institute for high schoolers coming this summer. And for the first time in March, we're going to try a community adult learner version of the course at St. Mary's. So we're sort of expanding, but the core course is still Dialogue and Civil Discourse. So in some ways, the election was the turning point that led to a focus on the importance of engaged dialogue across difference for me, and got me started thinking about the promise and the perils of seeing philosophy as a way to help build philosopher folks. But in reality, the seeds of my interest in dialogue across difference were planted much earlier. In fact, as a Mennonite, a member of an Anabaptist peace church, peacemaking and conflict resolution had always been held up not only as an ideal based on Jesus' teaching, but also as a set of practices deeply worth engaging in the real world, no matter how messy it was, even when you couldn't know exactly what the outcomes would be. When I graduated from college, I did a year of voluntary service with Mennonite Word of Missions in Belfast, Northern Ireland. And I worked in a cross-community organization that was addressing the lasting effects of the troubles in the relationships between Catholics and Protestants in that area. And so this was in 2000, so it was after the worst of the troubles, but there was still, there still is ongoing polarization and strife across those communities. And from that experience, I learned that even communities that are beset by intractable differences and conflict can make progress incrementally. Returning to the United States and attending Notre Dame for my PhD in philosophy, I studied both contemporary philosophical hermeneutics and ancient virtue ethics. And in philosophical hermeneutics, I was drawn to the claims that how we see the world is influenced by our experiences and our background beliefs and assumptions. And that if we don't recognize these, then we can't sort of fuse our horizons with the other we're trying to understand, whether that's a text or a person. As a student of ancient Greek virtue ethics, I was moved by the idea that the response to a chaotic world can be to form ourselves into the kind of people who develop particular virtues and dispositions necessary to live a good life, even when in the face of upheaval. So drawing from these traditions and my own experiences, informed by texts of ancient and contemporary philosophers and social scientists who research philosophical or best pedagogical practices for creating dialogue, I've collaborated with others at St. Mary's to create and continually revise a set of aspirational virtues paired with practical tools that can help us build ourselves into philosopher folks, the kind of participants in a democracy who don't need to wait around for their leaders to do better, but who can start making themselves better in the meantime. So today I want to talk about the four of the virtues that we emphasize in class. You'll see the 6 that we talk about in class are all in the bookmark, but we're talking about 4 today. And then the skills for productive dialogue that help us grow these virtues. Since I see developing virtues and skills for good dialogue as preconditions for building ourselves into philosopher folks. So the first virtue we discuss in class is attention. And the corresponding skill is offering attention to self and others. And as evidence of the constantly evolving nature of this project, I'll admit that attention wasn't even initially on my radar for the first couple of years that I taught that, but for the helpful contributions of Molly Gower, my colleague in religious studies and theology at St. Mary's, who's here today. And she helped me see that a precondition for all productive dialogue is really attention to self and others. The language of offering attention rather than paying attention, the more transactional way we often talk about it, Molly points out to me, emphasizes the gift it truly is to sit with self and others. Ancient wisdom traditions tell us this about meditation and prayer. Contemporary cognitive science is equally clear that mindfulness and meditation have dramatic benefits for calming the central nervous system and reducing stress. So I now start many dialogue classes with attention exercises, another practice I've learned from Molly, encouraging students first to sit with and experience what their bodies and senses are telling them about what they bring to our conversations, or to spend a moment journaling reflectively, and to share a word or two with a partner nearby about this experience so that they can notice that everybody comes to a conversation with a set of experiences that affect how we engage. When we discuss attention, I also emphasize attention to context and attention to the goal of a conversation. So conversations can so easily be derailed by the wrong context or goal. So what makes for a good context? Well, as we've probably all learned the hard way at some point in time or another, like a Thanksgiving dinner with all your politically polarized cousins is probably not the place, not the right context for a political discussion. Doesn't mean you couldn't have a productive discussion with that crew under other circumstances, but when people have spent a long time preparing a kind of ritual meal, that might not be it. I've learned this as a vegan, because if you start talking about veganism at Thanksgiving dinner, you pretty quickly turn everything south. Similarly, if you're hungry or tired or stressed, this has been something that as I just learned a little bit about neuroscience, I get really interested in realizing just how much we can't actually marshal our best cognitive resources if these basic things are lacking, if we're tired or hungry, if our body wants us to take care in other ways. Or of course, if the person you're talking to doesn't respect you or is just a troll, that's why social media is so rarely productive, not because it couldn't be, but because it kind of brings out our trolliest instincts and other people's. So I always say to students though, that it's valuable to engage in these hard conversations, but only when the context is right and only when you're up for it. You don't owe anyone your emotional energy. I think that's particularly important to tell young women at St. Mary's. You can always say, I'm not up for this conversation right now. And I've also come to realize through this work that it's extremely important to acknowledge that different people have different amounts of energy for the work of engaging across difference. So those who experience discrimination, dehumanization, dismissal on a regular basis are probably not going to have the stores of energy for engaging with some views. And I think that's a key piece of offering attention to self, is knowing when you're up for something and when you're not up for it. So that's all attention to context. When you offer attention to self and others, you can see when you're up for a hard conversation, when the context is likely to be productive. But we should also attend to the goal of a conversation, not to persuade, but to understand. This was a hard thing for me to learn as a philosopher, but aiming to persuade means you aren't in control of the outcome. You can't determine whether you can't control whether someone finds what you're saying persuasive or not. But aiming to understand gives you a better chance of achieving what you set out to do, even if that means coming to understand that the other person has a view you don't share and you're glad you don't share. By practicing the skill of attention to self and others, philosopher folks can grow in attention, recognizing when the context is right for a hard conversation, and aiming to understand rather than persuade.
If it is language that makes us human, one half of language is to listen. Silence can exist without speech, but speech cannot live without silence. Listen to the speech of others. Listen even more to their silence. To pray is to listen to the revelations of nature, to the meaning of events.
Empathy. Empathy is closely connected to attention. The definition of empathy that I operate with is offered by philosopher Lori Brun, who writes specifically about what she calls entangled empathy, which she defines as an experiential process involving a blend of emotion and cognition in which we recognize that we are in relationships with others and are called upon to be responsive and responsible in these relationships by attending to another's needs, interests, desires, vulnerabilities, hopes, and sensitivities. I appreciate this definition's emphasis on our embeddedness in relationships and communities, as well as her emphasis on both emotion and cognition. Though many might see philosophers as dispassionately choosing reason over emotion, I find emotions to be particularly disclosive about what matters to us, and I find they can point us in the direction of investigating why things matter to us. Students often enter the dialogue class assuming that they have to avoid all emotion and talk dispassionately. And so when I sort of say, what do you see a good conversation as requiring, then they often will say, leaving your emotions at the door and being objective. But this is actually contrary to the aims of the course. Rather, attending to self and others requires room for expressions of experiences, emotions, and values, since these inform how we understand ourselves and how we view the world. They also help us share with others what matters most to us so they can see the context that we're coming from. Being able to learn from these expressions in others and growing in empathy requires the skill of good listening. To develop listening skills in class, I give students prompts for discussion that ask them to connect their views to their values and experiences. And so we often go around in a circle, only speaking when it's their turn. So we even pre-COVID days pass an object around, so you only speak when you're holding the object. And I first found this very kind of clunky and artificial, but what myself and many students have found since, I think, is that when you're not speaking and you know you're not going to be speaking, you are focusing on listening to understand rather than listening to reply or just waiting your turn to reply. So to do this, I asked them to act as detectives, to connect the dots between other students' values, beliefs, and experiences. Or if another student, they'll listen to a student tell a story and then respond by saying, here's the value that I hear in that story. Students almost uniformly report, and I've definitely found this myself, that when you start really listening, you realize that you were pretty bad at it before. At least, we have found that often. Between distractions and sort of social anxieties in your head, making you wonder what other people are thinking of you, and kind of preparing for your next turn to speak, and focusing on how other people's experience compares to yours, the natural tendency to want to turn it back to your experience. It can be truly hard to listen carefully. But though difficult, the skill of careful listening strengthens with practice and can help grow the virtue of empathy. If I'm truly interested in another's experience and listen to understand rather than to persuade or just waiting for my turn to reply, then I'm more likely to imagine how I might feel if I saw the world through their eyes. I'm less likely to see them as an other and more likely to see them as worthy of the moral consideration I wish for myself. In any conversation, we can practice listening to understand rather than reply by giving a person space to talk without interruption, by letting our own distracting thoughts come and go, like clouds in the sky. You sometimes hear folks in kind of mindfulness settings say. So we can remain attentive to the conversation at hand by asking open-ended questions like, what did that feel like? Or why was that so important to you? And by listening to hear the values and experiences behind the views. So I often remember an exchange between students in a class when we were talking about guns. And it started very contentiously. The sort of students who really were in favor of more gun restrictions couldn't understand why somebody else would prioritize their desire to shoot for sport over somebody else's safety. The students who were more interested in defending a broad interpretation of the Second Amendment couldn't understand why there was such fear and disdain for items that they had grown up around in their house without thinking of as so morally weighty. So I asked the students to speak in more detail about their experience with guns. And one student from a rural area talked about her father sort of having a rite of passage with every child where he would take them out and teach them to safely hold and clean a gun, and they would go hunting together was a family tradition. And so this had felt like a rite of passage for her. Another student from Chicago talked tearfully about having experienced the loss of 2 family members to gang violence in the streets of Chicago. Neither student changed her mind about her basic beliefs, but there was a general sense of understanding each other's experience that was made possible by listening and connecting these dots. And that allowed us to enter a conversation about policy and restrictions much more productively, because we had kind of done that work of listening and growing in empathy ahead of time. So by strengthening our listening skills, philosopher folks can grow in empathy and hear the experiences of those who are different from them, connecting the dots between another's values, views, and experiences. It's really wonderful to hear live music when you have hardly heard live music in a year and a half. It's really moving. Thank you. So curiosity. If empathy is sometimes outside the philosopher's wheelhouse, curiosity is firmly within it. Aristotle says that philosophy begins in wonder, the Greek word thauma, which is both the brightness of eyes wide open wonder and the darkness of confusing bewilderment. Philosophy wants us to approach, to ask questions, to wonder, to learn, to experience bewilderment. And again, both ancient wisdom traditions and contemporary cognitive sciences converge on the same conclusion when it comes to curiosity. Psychologists may talk about openness and growth mindset, but the insight is the same. We are more likely to flourish as friends, colleagues, partners, and citizens when we are oriented towards the other and to ourselves with openness and curiosity. The opposite of curiosity is defensiveness, which I see as a common obstacle to productive conversation. If defensiveness puts up a wall, shutting us down to engagement, curiosity opens us up for engagement, orienting us towards our interlocutor. I try to help students and myself notice defensiveness as a helpful marker, a kind of red flag to pay attention to, a place to investigate and deploy curiosity, to ask ourselves, what would it look like to turn this defensiveness I'm experiencing to curiosity? Practically speaking, in any classroom, curiosity can be nurtured by helping students practice formulating curious questions in response to defensiveness. In one exchange between a progressive pro-choice student and a conservative pro-life student during a discussion of immigration policy, the progressive student asked, how can you be so hypocritical as to believe that fetuses' lives matter, but the lives of children in cages on the southern border don't matter? In order to kind of note the defensiveness and the way in which a question formulated like this would probably provoke defensiveness in another, but move into curiosity, we talked about how to reframe this question as a curious question. So we landed on something sort of like, I know that you deeply value the lives of vulnerable children, so I'm curious about how you think about that value in connection with our current practices of immigration enforcement. So leading with recognizing the value that the other student had, that probably they share on some level, and giving that student a genuine opportunity to reply rather than just stoking defensiveness by saying, how can you be such a hypocrite? Leading with curiosity, connecting her question to values, led to a much more productive engagement and gave the other student a genuine opportunity to reply. And it did give rise to an interesting discussion about what actually was happening at the southern border, because students weren't getting the same information from their various news sources about what actually what the one student was referring to. Another extraordinary example of turning defensiveness to curiosity occurred in an exchange between a Black student who was an outspoken advocate within the Black Lives Matter movement and a police officer who described himself as a Blue Lives Matter guy. So this student was working in an internship in a police station, and because I had, or that put her in a police station occasionally at least, and because I had assigned students to engage in a conversation with someone who had different views from them outside of class, she decided to ask this police officer if he would talk to her about his views on Black Lives Matter. Now, for the record, this took a kind of courage and extraordinary curiosity that I would never have expected or assigned. In fact, an impulse I fight with myself as a teacher is I would have actually wanted to protect this student from a conversation like this. But she has agency, something I learned over and over again to respect in my students, and courage, and she chose to initiate that conversation. She wanted to. So she said it was difficult, and she noted that while she felt she came to understand a bit more about where he was coming from, and how his experiences led to his views, she did not herself come away feeling heard or understood by him. She didn't find him to be a particularly good listener. She said he was more interested in talking about himself than in asking questions about her. So you might think, well, this encounter is not exactly a success story. But to me, the really remarkable thing about it is that she was able to learn and to exercise curiosity even when defensiveness would have been warranted, even though he wasn't an optimal dialogue partner. Now that is truly above and beyond. I wouldn't universally recommend that people put themselves necessarily in experiences like that if they're not up for it. But it does illustrate that one can have some measure of control over the outcome when one's goal is to listen with curiosity and to understand rather than persuade. Now, I do want to be clear, tools of persuasion have a role in the world. I'm a philosopher. I think there are definitely times to persuade. We want to persuade other people to value the good, the true, and the beautiful. We want to advocate for justice and critique broken systems. But trying to persuade someone you don't see eye to eye with will likely end in failure and frustration unless your engagement occurs within a context of trust made possible by virtues like attention, empathy, and curiosity. So by offering attention, listening empathetically, and asking curious questions, philosopher folks can create conditions of trust in their communities so that productive conversations across difference are possible.
It occurs to me that we may not have done a responsive reading in 20 or so months. So you can find in your blue window, number 650. Perish your doubts, for doubt is the attendant of truth. A belief which may not be questioned binds us to error, for there is incompleteness and imperfection in every belief.
Doubt is the not known truth, and the massive that keeps away all.
Let no one fear the truth, that doubt may consume it, for doubt is a testing of belief.
Truth stands boldly, not afraid. It is not shaken by the testing.
For truth, if it be truth, arises from each testing stronger, more secure.
Those who silence doubt and filled with fear, their house is built on shifting sand.
But those who fear not doubt and know its use are founded on rock.
They shall walk in the light of knowledge and grow in the science of yours.
Therefore, let us not fear doubt, but let us rejoice in its help.
It is the wise of me. God is the defender of truth.
That's the perfect reading to transition between thinking about curiosity and helping ourselves be directed and oriented towards seeking the truth together, but also recognizing the ways in which we need intellectual humility as part of that process. So intellectual humility. Of course, if you're truly open and curious about the views of others, you have to be prepared for the possibility that engagement with others' views might lead you to conclude that your own views come up short in some respects. Intellectual humility as a virtue enables us to recognize the limitations of our own perspective and then encourages us to seek out the views of others, both to test our positions for clarity and consistency, and to constantly be reminded that our experiences aren't universal, that our knowledge isn't complete. We can and should be people of conviction, but that conviction should come along with the desire to continually test and strengthen our beliefs, to find weak spots and unsupported assumptions. Social science research confirms the value of intellectual humility, suggesting that it correlates with greater open-mindedness, empathy, pro-social values, and tolerance towards diverse ideas and people. Harvard political scientist Danielle S. Allen beautifully describes the opportunities presented by such humility. She says, engage a stranger in conversation across a racial, ethnic, or class divide, and one gets not only an extra pair of eyes, but also an ability to see and understand parts of the world that are to oneself invisible. Actively trying to seek out the parts of the world that are to oneself invisible is a way to think about intellectual humility that I love. In class, we engage in several concrete practices to nurture intellectual humility. First, we work to excavate our own prejudgments in reflective journals and small group discussions by asking what assumptions, cultural, political, and religious, undergird our views, and how they differ from the primary assumptions of others. Everybody's beliefs are structured by sets of assumptions, but sometimes when you realize how different those primary assumptions are, you can sidestep some of the most unproductive parts of a conversation because you realize the core, the sort of core beliefs are in themselves quite different. Secondly, I encourage students to investigate the limits of their own knowledge. So for example, in one exercise, before a discussion on immigration, I have students write everything they know about US immigration policy on paper before we start. Students realize then that they know very little about the policies themselves, and this primes them to learn from others. Sometimes the experience of students who have themselves immigrated or who are children of immigrants who might have direct knowledge and experience. So for example, in one class period where we were discussing immigration, I had them start, so they write, it's a little prompt sheet, and they write like, what facts would one have to know in order to have an informed view on immigration? What do you actually know? And what questions do you have first for somebody who doesn't agree with you? So one student had gone into the exercise and the conversation pretty confident that undocumented immigrants should get in line and wait their turn according to the system in the interest of fairness. So the value there was fairness. Another student shared that her own parents had been waiting 30 years for the process to work. The first student's jaw, like her mouth literally dropped open. And she said she hadn't realized that about the process. And she could now understand why somebody might come here without documentation if the length of time would be something like that. And so she then thought that a more reasonable response, it wasn't that she suddenly thought we should have no immigration policies, but she thought maybe we should focus on more efficiency and overhauling our system. So in our practical lives outside the classroom, we can seek out the views of smart people who disagree with us on issues that matter to us. We can ask where the weak spots in our own arguments are. We can continually ask where our own blind spots might be, since we know we all have them. By investigating our own blind spots and by seeking out the parts of the world that are invisible to us, philosopher folks can grow in intellectual humility, following Socrates and seeing true wisdom as knowing what we don't know. So to conclude, if philosopher folks commit to growing in these virtues essential for good engagement, we can imagine a future better than the present. in which polarization doesn't automatically short circuit productive engagement. After all, these virtues are not the provenance of the political left or right. Rather, any minimally decent person should strive to embody them. My remarks today mean to suggest that growing in virtues can help us discuss polarizing views productively, something that many people consider impossible in this era. Together, we can build ourselves into philosopher folks, ordinary, engaged citizens who grow in the virtues necessary for pursuing the common good together. If this sort of commitment to philosophical transformation in its ancient form could be pursued on a wider scale, it would create a natural obstacle to the illiberal and undemocratic forces that thrive on misinformation, villainization, propaganda, and fear. Though personal change is no alternative to systemic change and critique, individuals can habituate themselves into dispositions that help produce trust within communities, and communities with greater levels of trust will be more likely to support productive dialogue across difference. As a teacher and a person, I know this habituation has been at work in my own life. I noticed that practicing the virtues we engage in class is becoming more habitual in my professional and personal relationships. I routinely check my own defensiveness and transition to curiosity in engagements with my spouse, or notice myself trying and often failing to get clear about the lens my teenagers look at the world through. I try. I'm far from expert myself. I am routinely overwhelmed by the difficulties of a broken democracy and unjust systems and institutions that aren't worthy of trust. I'm often derailed by the seductive pull of snark or righteous indignation and the typical but still difficult complications of being a human in relationships. But when I am tempted to be disheartened by these facts, I think of how far our classroom community of students comes every semester in 6 short weeks. And I am reminded that though perfection is never a possibility, as the ancient virtue ethicists remind us over and over, we can pursue a meaningful life of incremental progress. In short, philosopher folks can contribute to communities that engage in practices of building rather than eroding trust, including the communities in our classrooms, churches, community groups, and families, and perhaps even local and national democracy more broadly, if one dares to dream.
Thank you, Megan. I brought Megan here because more than one student has sat in my office and said, I can talk to my parents again. So to the work of this congregation, which is weaving a tapestry of love and action, we dedicate our lives and these offerings. like you're on Zoom, you can please unmute yourself and join us in the closing covenant. Love is the spirit of the church. And
Service is law.
Together in peace, to seek the truth in love,
And
and to help one another.
It's our covenant.
This is our covenant.
Before we gather here again, may we be surprised by the gifts that surround us. May we find awe in a world of compassion composed of contrast. And may we be enlivened by curiosity. And may we remain together in spirit. Go in peace.
I know, it's really very integrated. I mean, it's, I actually like what you've done, so how you want to feel like it has to sort of wondered if I should pause, and then I saw it was back on one side. Not interested in this, I could get him a
Yeah, I got my. Yeah, I mean, she's okay. I mean, again, she's like, I'm so glad I'm texting. It's way worse. I get like, tired, and like, definitely hit me, not just being fine. But definitely the kind of thing where I'm glad this is what
I mean, she hasn't read it yet. It's not
Karen, that was lovely. Very nice.
I've never done all this.
Elements you chose were nice, like I didn't remember what all they were, but they all were. Yeah.
I should have got somebody else.
And I think you met Mike at camping with Krista Bailey. That was a while ago. Tree houses, yeah. Yeah, we definitely. How are you liking being in South Bend? Are you, is your house?
Oh, that's right.
But you're living here. Now my hope is that maybe someday on the holidays we can have like an open house or something. It'd be fun to see. Where is it? Are you remodeling? Okay. Are you remodeling? Oh, no, she's very. Are you living in while remodeling? Oh, holidays in general, like setting into January, the New Year. St. Patrick's Day, Flag Day.
Well, what I've been doing.
Well, good to see you guys. Very wonderful, wonderful job. We'll see you. It's super great. Hey, how are you? Hey.
Very good to see you here.
You know, Mike.
I think we've met before. I'm Jim. Yeah, nice to meet you.
Thank you for reserving our seats.
Right.
I mean, it's very emotional and very.
But they seem to be like a pretty good number.
That's not the right word, cautious. Anyway,
This is great. I love the message. Oh my God.
she was like, I love that. Yeah, very emotional. Then
Yeah, we all
I
can
went
get
to
out
the
of this
board,
somehow.
and they eventually, they were all like,
Survive.
it's
We can't keep this.
and then eventually, everyone voted.
I do miss things like, you know, tea after the service.
Yes.
or,
But there's,
And not technically, I think we're supposed to be having this conversation outside.
Yeah.
oh, I told him I gave.
Yeah, it's kind of cold in
So what are you? And so many other people don't love.
Okay, you know, I've heard
We all talk.
anecdotes about this. He just told me what to do. He did not
Push it
one
so
second
far.
discourage me or dispute
Done
what I
anything fun
said.
today?
And after Lisa Presley, I felt like, no, I'm that, you know. But,
So we have to go through.
No concrete plans, thinking
well,
about maybe
let's
next
call
Friday.
them, get like,
Little hang
call
out
them.
time. Spend a lot of time with them.
Yeah, that one at least is a good person. I thought she was not helpful, not really very helpful. We did.
How about you?
It was the RE thing.
I don't think so.
Yeah,
Maybe Kathy Platt and I will go to the library.
well, she gave us that woman, but it just sort of went nowhere. Well, they did what's called a
Oh,
good
it's
fellow.
today's the grand opening, isn't it?
Which
It is,
somebody
although Trump,
I should go to
Trump heard something on the radio about they may be closing up again because they didn't really get finished in time. I don't know, will we?
You know when the.
And then they have,
Well,
I think if
That's a
people
good
speak
question,
up,
and I don't know.
Yeah.
it's gonna be hard to ignore.
Kathy said there was gonna be music at 2
Part of the
o'clock.
problem is,
But I think you're
you can get weighted down in the
Soon I should definitely try to do that. Every time we go to
Yeah.
when that's open, I will be there all the time.
It's very exciting. I haven't seen it yet.
I mean, it's humongous.
What's that?
It's humongous.
Yeah.
What are we doing here?
So how's your house, Mike?
We've already established.
Slowly making progress.
Slow and sure. The price has been a little sure, more sure lately, I think, like some walls are going.
You're
Definitely feels.
building a house or remodeling?
They bought it out that way. And Cope's house.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay. I didn't realize you were, you're working on that. Okay. And but then you have a plan to have a lake?
No, but Mike moved here from Michigan, so maybe.
Oh,
that's
okay,
part of
okay.
it.
I was originally trying to find something like
Some people
Oh,
do
okay.
it, but it's
Okay.
like, yep.
Yeah, that's a cool
everybody's
house.
Yeah.
So they've taken the wall down to the
Yeah.
kitchen and dining room?
Well, they've left us
And
standing
they
up
were
because we
from
have to reinforce the ceiling, and so until we do that, then that just goes up, it all drywall and all that.
So it's weird that, there's not a wall, but there are all these boulders.
So you can at least kind of get a vision of what it will look like, because you can see.
And it does bring a lot more light, I think, to the kitchen and dining room.
That's it. I just had a conversation about light.
People on the board.
I think I'm gonna be in the market for a house maybe in the spring or summer, we'll see. But I have a Pittsburgh house, I think I'm selling it because it's worth too much money to
She
people.
is
Like, not to it,
Yeah.
it's skyrocketed.
And,
And,
board member,
and,
I have a lot of respect for her. She's
but
not-
my needs on a house, like, are wall space.
All that.
So I don't really,
And,
like, and I look at houses here and they're all doors and windows.
Yeah.
And
So
I like flat books.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, but I don't wanna buy a huge house with a library, like that's way beyond my needs. So I need to find a house that has wall space as opposed to doors and windows. So,
Or you can get rid of your books.
that's not happening.
Spare bedrooms for them.
But do you sell books?
What's that?
Do you sell books on?
I sell, I mean, there's certain areas I sell, like first edition, things like that, like very popular books.
Those 10 represent more than 10.
So it's just like a hobby. I love my books. But in my one bedroom apartment, I have like 7 bookshelves around like a living dining area because there's interior walls. And I look at a small house and I'm like, okay, where would I put 7 bookshelves? But the right house.
Yeah.
This is the right place.
I've seen some small houses where you can totally do that.
And you might put them perpendicular to the wall.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm thinking is I'm probably gonna end up with more of a ranch, like fifties era house. Because if there's like if there's a finishable basement, if there's like a real basement, like that.
Right.
Well, I'm
would be
gonna
perfect for-
give it my best shot.
Like Mike.
Like you try to do, and I'm not afraid to
Finishable basement.
give up.
Have you started on that?
That's all very.
No, some ducks,
It was sort of an end run around the
And,
bureaucracy, but it was
the
important,
guys
which
delayed
I've
it.
been used to doing, and I.
That's a lot of what this is.
I don't.
Oh, the shortest guy is too busy for another.
You know, well, anyway, but.
You have to put in,
My
like,
level of respect
I don't know
for UA
what
and
you do to mitigate water.
declined greatly
because I know that
There's no water down there. We're gonna use interior, like wood for the floor.
It's very entrenched.
Oh, yeah, God.
Very hidebound in a lot of ways.
But it just seems to be pretty dry basement.
I don't think it's this for a benefit.
Yeah, that's why I'm sure the right house come along. But I've been in that house once and
This whole process of headphones, who's minister?
And that's a cool neighborhood.
Not help church
Yeah.
our size and our capability. Yeah.
Was that see you? Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Glad you came today. Oh, she hasn't cast yet.
Well, but she did it.
Oh, I know, I think just doing it is an
Right.
accomplishment. Well, she doesn't like that kind of stuff at all, but she has toughened up a lot.
She really has. I mean, the theory, she was just the best.
See you later.
Like, okay, I've studied, I know I can do it. Yeah, well, I finally just said, she's like, you know, we're all hurting from the pandemic. Chip was hurting. It's like, well, we are hurting too. You need to listen to us. And I think, I don't know, but I think opening the question is the biggest part. And people will settle down. And then Lynn is calling them. I'm gonna talk with her about how to set it up. And I think that will give her a sense of control. But it's not like the chip restoration was coming to DC.
And
Lord,
right.
I talked to her for 45 minutes. I talked to Dan Holmes for like an hour and a half, but they would have gone on. You know, people feel very strong.
I think that's a similar argument too when I took it to Vermont, at least part of that.
Well,
I think it's the
also,
same.
I know, you have to figure out.
Did you change in like Albany or
Like, if we're like a
Rensselaer?
social club. Some people, that's what they want. And then the sermon doesn't matter so much. We just try to promote social ties and work hard. And some people, I think that's what they're into.
Yeah.
She has come here, but it's not in the same track.
Right.
Right.
You can do that with really good, we're an office. It organizes us and keeps us on.
I thought it was very pleasant, although, you know, it's a little bit odd. We have these hallways that take you to the dining car and are about this big.
I actually really like it because like
There's so much.
And the aggravation is besides. And then,
the
if we want
teachers
to
are
be
on
like
that
a
WhatsApp
piece
thread.
and
And
just.
next time you're looking,
Oh,
there's
that's
like
right.
a little.
And yes, you comment actually does. And so.
I wasn't actually sure what that was, like I saw that it was
People
not,
know.
but I wasn't sure what you were doing with that.
And.
Well,
so
it occurred to me you're
we're
taking
gonna have
a
this.
turn.
But it was so funny. I don't know if you can see, and I think that will clarify
Held
this
up
too.
The shower
And if we want sort of
there's the toilet and then
theological,
My
space between the door, like that woman today,
I'd have to be desperate.
you know, that, you need to look for somebody like that.
So it's gonna come down on the toilet.
Well, there's a minister shortage now.
I really did
Yeah,
like it when we
so
came and I
it
took
took
it.
us-
I mean, it takes a long time, but there's so much more
I mean,
freedom of movement,
there's not,
you know,
there's fewer
on a
ministers.
plane or just
actually,
in your seat. But being
Yeah,
able
I
to
think-
like
Walk
walk to the
I think they
dining car,
have-
walk to the table, and play
People
cards,
who have
and
the skills to be good, intelligent.
walk to the lounge car, and also, I went to
I'm glad we're back together.
the sleeping car, and it was.
I sent Chip some challenges.
So you said
14
regular seat.
hours.
I'm
But the
guessing.
regular seats are actually.
It lasted.
Right, I'm
Sunday.
guessing it's not bad.
When he was in
Oh,
school,
pretty
he
well.
got a question wrong, but he thought it was fine. That was his.
Well, I just think it's a different view of the countryside.
Hard to nail the teacher.
I mean,
Yeah, and that
you've
was
heard
right.
me go on about this, but
And I'm like,
That's a
okay,
different
well,
view
you
of
have a
travel.
commitment to being right. Does this help you as a minister? How
I
does
mean,
it
it
work?
doesn't make sense.
Like,
There were
open-minded
international
questions.
people on the trip, because they
And then
travel
I
by
said,
train
you're
so much
supposed
that
to
they're
be the
used to
face
this.
of our religion community. How
And
can
there were
you
like
do
Amish
this?
people.
oh, really?
Yeah.
I asked him questions like that, so we'll see what, everybody's
I
afraid
think we
to say
didn't
that
see as
stuff.
much of
Yeah,
that.
no, it's gotta be
Plus,
said.
they didn't have
It's gotta
the
be put out
lounge
there.
car.
You can't say it's not
And I
needed.
think that.
Well, anyway, I'm having an
And we had a lounge
interesting
car in dining
relationship
car,
with
and
the
we were
city
traveling
and
in the sea,
Santi.
which I think
He's a
probably
killer.
Like there was
And
this
I stood
announcement
up, you know, that guy
that
is
you
trying to
must
pull
wear
the
your
coat.
mask all the
His name is
time.
Rick
Well, of course,
Williams.
we didn't wear a mask all
He's
the
working
time.
with
We had a
Henry,
private room.
and he says,
But I
well,
assume the people.
Right.
no, his name is Rick
Yeah,
I mean,
Williams.
when you wear a
He
mask
called
all the
me
time,
up and I saw Rick Williams on the thing. I thought, oh, it's Rich. I'm like, hi, Rich, blah, blah.
And-
then
That's
it's-
a work day, really.
But
They were threatening.
Henry, he
If
said,
you're not
I got
wearing a
Henry,
mask, you
Henry,
can't
I'm
ride
not
a
gonna allow
train.
Henry to
Yeah.
knock heads together. That's not what this is about, Henry. How can we all work together?
All right, good to see you.
So they
Good to
had
see
me
you too.
speak briefly,
Thanks again.
and I said,
Thanks for
well,
coming Friday, that was nice.
I think the city needs to be more open, so we put from the community, and like Santi had thrown out a few budget numbers that I never heard. How much are they spending on it? Nobody knows. And then council's mad at him. So I said,
He follows James's approach, which is like, hold it all close to the vest, and, you know, and it's not, I don't think it's very productive.
well, that's what I said. And then James is like, you should be, you have incredible lack of gratitude. And the city, you know, you're the homeless coordinator, you're the neighborhood association. You know, we have done so much for you, and you're on the land bank. And sort of this is an incredible lack of gratitude.
Yeah. So if we plug this into,
well,
He gets the fence, he can't get the fence.
poor guy. And
Which is really too bad, because it doesn't do any good.
well, I think like he thought the near west side was mad at him, not the council. And then, so I said, well, Santi, I just have too much to put in an email. Would you like to come over to my house for dinner? And he's out of town until December 1. He's in Colombia
Oh my gosh.
visiting his family.
Wow.
Gladys is so mad at him. And it's Santi. And poor guy, he doesn't, he didn't even know what I was talking about.
Whatever's going
And,
around.
But I was at John Brown's fundraiser, and James, I ran into Michelle Beatty, and she said, well, thank God you're here. James has been bending my ear for an hour about what's wrong with the city council. And I thought, well, Michelle Beatty, you know, why is he, I don't think you should trash people except to your closest friends.
No, you know, I usually,
Well, I just
I
thought
set
that's
this one
very
like 5, and
mean-spirited.
then like if I have a different speaker we're having.
It's like, what is wrong with our mayor that he's trashing people to a member of the general public? Anyway, I was gonna put that in the email, but then I forgot. Yeah, but anyway, what do you just say?
Oh, I was gonna say, you know, I worked with.
When you sign that, it should be form correct.
Lori Hammond and
Yeah.
Eli
It
Lash.
shouldn't have to mess with these, once
Right.
They
they
were
were
the
set,
members of signing.
then we get the.
And-
Yes, I agree, and those shouldn't have to mess with them, because I think those, you know, it goes through this first, goes through the slider first, then to this.
You know, it's gonna be, as soon as we can get somebody to get it in.
Well, I can bring, are you available to work next?
And the whole team.
It's my day to do Zoom, so I can just bring my laptop and I'll just sit there, and then also control it, and I can hear everything in my headphones.
Oh, that's good. That's good. That's
So that was
amazing.
probably, yeah, it was probably the smoothest one, because part of it was, there was just a whole lot of.
Well, actually, I didn't know that you were back in work.
Right, but we're getting
Well,
it,
good
it's
for
just
you.
a bit complicated.
Well, Rachel was at the fundraiser.
That was us
James,
trying to
they-
gain access to.
Let's make it Steve's. And Rachel's always been fine to me, but council people really don't like her. And I think she's kind of a tool of the administration, but, which I think James is doing on purpose, because he doesn't want to criticize them.
Yeah.
But the racial politics of all that are really bad.
Yeah, well, that's right.
And Karen is really mad at him because she repeatedly requested information and won't give it to her. Well, Karen is the epitome of reason, but I don't know if she's gonna be terrible if she doesn't like you, I imagine. So
I couldn't always see
But-
the face.
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's interesting, is last week.
Well, Karen brought
Right
me
now,
up.
it's supposed to be speaking.
Oh, yeah, well, she's alive. Well, anyway, this guy, Rick,
And they wanted to see the people, they didn't want to listen to
but,
each of them speaking.
he made a lot of sense.
Some of the two were speaking, so they don't want to see.
Well, they want Cassidy
They wanted
to
to see
off.
everybody else.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of a personal preference, but I understood it.
But if you're seeing chip thick, you're, we want to see.
Yes, yeah, and then, yeah, that was like, oh, you know, put the people.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
Yep.
Welcome. Okay, so I think we're good, and so I'll come in if you want to come too, and Ken can then, I think, can be the one to be the host for home. I'll email him. Devin will be here, and I'll bring my laptop, and it has everything separate.
Well, I have to see if we can, we got 2,300.
Yeah, so having another desktop would be great.
Yeah.
I think, you know, put the good one on managing Zoom, and then we can have one as well. Like, we can use this one, and use it as a monitor, get a new one, or whatever.
If you can get one as good as that.
I think we can can easily get one for, $1,200, you can buy a killer PC these days.
We need a $500 switch, video switch, and then each camera is gonna run around $100 to $200 plus everything that you see on the cables.
Do we need another camera?
People are wanting 3 or 4. Really? But
So that's gonna require somebody, another person practically to manage that.
it will. What people are telling me, they think what they see right now is incredibly constricted.
Well, it is constrictive, but I think if you work within that, better than trying to manage 4 cameras. Man, that's gonna be killer.
Even as soon as it goes to more than 1 camera, I need a switch.
I agree, and you're gonna have to.
Now, the cameras that they're talking about wanting, unfortunately, this camera has the ability to zoom, but it can't do it while something is using it.
Got it. So you
So-
have to set it up first and then it.
And somebody said, well, that's easy. You can just turn the video feed off and change it while in the middle of service.
Well, can't we zoom back just a little bit so that we get from here to here?
Well, we asked people online, and when we had it, right now it's Zoom from here, actually what we did is a chip, I'm a little taller than Chip, but the Chip is standing here, he can go like this, and his hands are in the corner of his hair.
Okay.
And
Seems good.
when we backed away, they said they couldn't see his face. They could see his body, but they couldn't see expressions.
Okay,
So-
so that's not so good then. So, well, I would just, if it were me, I would just wait and see if one camera's gonna do it.
This camera gets everything from here to the equivalent on the other side.
Right.
In high definition.
Yeah.
Which means when somebody comes up here and does this, or somebody's over here singing,
Yeah.
it would work.
Yeah.
It would be off center, but it would work. So if we got a camera, another one, and put it over here and simply had a close-up of the pulpit. When the sermon's playing, you can use one. When it's not, you're playing, you use the other.
Yeah.
The trouble with it is you still have to have a way to switch between them. And I believe you can put 2 cameras into your computer, and you might be able to switch between them with software in the computer without being too clunky. But we also had people that said, I want to be able to zoom in on the joys and concerns person, and I want to be able to zoom in on the performer. And there's also people who want a camera that can be showing the congregation.
Yeah, I know, but
You and me are in the same boat.
you're gonna have a crew of 3 people, you gotta have a rotation, we don't have the people to do that.
And what was said in the meeting was, well, we might have to hire an